I want to introduce myself. I'm Leith Dunn. I'm head of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies Mona Campus Unit. And I want to warmly welcome each of you. I see a number of faculty members, staff, students, and we have our network members with us, the African Caribbean Women's Migration Diaspora Network. And I'm going to invite Dr. Susan Scarf to really introduce our project as to why we're here, and then we'll move on with the program. Please welcome Dr. Scarf, who is from London South Bank University.
Thank you, Leith, and thank you everyone for coming. I'm just going to very briefly say something about the network. We are a research network that's funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the UK, and we're looking primarily at African Caribbean women's mobility in relation to concepts of diaspora. So we're looking at diasporic communities, how diaspora shapes individuals. We're looking at different kinds of mobility that contribute to the formation of diaspora communities and so on. There are 12 of us altogether, myself as the principal investigator and Leith as the co-investigator, and we have 4 sort of events across 4 different territories. So this is the second of our events here at the Institute of Gender and Development Studies, University of the West Indies. We've just finished a very long day where we've had lots of presentations by our network members and by local scholars. We comprise, at the moment, 3 different territories: the UK, Canada, and the West and the Caribbean. Yeah. So, and we have a sort of rolling conversation over a period of 22 months. So this is really the first, actually this is the first public event that the network has had. So I'm very honoured to welcome you and to welcome our speakers. So thank you.
Now, some of our network members were unable to get here because we had a lightning strike and we had the hurricane, so flights were diverted. But we're going to be joined by them. They'll join us tomorrow by Skype. They include Dr. Lisa Trotz from the University of Toronto, Professor Shirley Tate, who is from Leicester, Leeds, and some others, right? So I'm just going to give you an overview of the program that we have. I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Paulette Ramsey, and I want to start with a nice rousing round of applause. Applause for her. Because we have so few women professors in the University of the West Indies, we celebrate when we have women moving and becoming and appointed, professors. And when I tell you about her background, her brief bio, you'll see why she is in fact ideal for this seminar. We have Susan, who is going to introduce Dr. Velma Pollard. Everyone knows Velma. Give her a hand as well. And Velma will be doing some of her readings as a poet and fiction writer. Then we have Miss Tanya Shirley, who is also a member of staff at the University of the West Indies, a poet, as well as a fiction writer. Give her a hand too. Okay. And we'll have a question and answer period at the end. So, who is this Paulette Ramsey? She holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts in a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of the West Indies, and she has a very distinguished pioneering research and publication record as an interdisciplinary scholar and researcher. And she's known regionally and internationally for her work in the field of modern languages and literatures, but much more than that. Her areas of focus on language pedagogy for her contribution to the work of Afro-Hispanic studies. She has also made a significant contribution to research on Afro-derived peoples and their literary and cultural production in Costa Rica, the migration of Jamaicans to Costa Rica, Ecuador, Cuba, and Mexico. Her work has brought the history, racial, and cultural dynamics related to various diasporic communities in Latin America and the Hispanic Caribbean to center stage. So she has made our Hispanic neighbors visible to us. Her postdoctoral work on Afro-Mexican, Afro-Cuban, Afro-Ecuadorian, Jamaican descendants in Ecuador has also been groundbreaking with her book entitled Afro-Mexican Constructions of Diaspora, Gender, Identity, and Nation in 2016. She has also looked at Afro-Mexican people of Costa Rica. Her research draws on interdisciplinary analyses underpinned by broad post-colonial criticism theories, aesthetics and postmodernist theories, gender studies, feminist studies, masculinity studies, and cultural studies as they relate to questions of marginality, statehood, cultural and individual identity, ethnicity, gender, and of subjectivity. The book she did receive the Mona Visitors Principals Award in 2016 for Best Research Publication in the book category. She has also published 26 peer-reviewed scholarly essays and articles, 10 review essays, 2 translated books, 1 co-edited book, Blooming with the Poise, which I think is quite popular. She has also done work as a translator, novelist, poet. She has published 4 works of fiction, and my favorite is Aunt Jen. So when we had this seminar, I suggested that we invite Professor Ramsey to talk about Aunt Jen and other bits of her work. Of course, Aunt Jen has been translated into German and Italian and has been used widely as part of the Caribbean literature courses in the US and UK, France, Germany, and Italy. Give her a clap for that. And then she has published poetry anthologies. She has also served, in addition to her scholarly work, as head of Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, and has helped to promote French, Spanish, which were on the decline. And we want to thank her for that as we live in a globalized society. She has made a significant contribution which led to the development of policy to reposition foreign languages in the University of the West Indies, which has allowed students here to do courses in foreign languages. There's a lot more that I could say about her, but I think she's also getting an award, another award. But I'm sure you want to hear from her and you don't want to hear any more from me. So please welcome her warmly.
Good evening, everyone. I decided to entitle my presentation in the following way: Interrogating Diaspora, Lessons Learned from a Fictional Protagonist. The suggestion by Dr. Leithdon to use my novel Aunt Jen as a point of departure for beginning or continuing a conversation on issues related to diaspora, migration, identity, gender, nation, at first seemed a bit unusual, too self-centered, too self-serving, I initially thought. However, after considering the various ways in which the same novel invites discussion of several post-colonial and post-diasporic issues through the carefully crafted letters of its curious and probing female protagonist, I decided to do exactly what was suggested. Besides, I also considered that this approach would allow me to deliver a somewhat less theoretically overloaded presentation. So let me begin with my reason for writing Aunt Jen. I always knew that I wanted to write. I grew up reading voraciously and wanted to write like Enid Blyton, Andrew Salkey, C. Everett Palmer, Mark Twain, Jack Schaefer, Michael Anthony, Garth St. Omer, Roger Mays, among others. Note that most of the writers were men living far away. even in the case of the Jamaicans. But I wanted to be one of Jamaica's women writers one day. And when I met Jean DaCosta as a teenager, I knew it was possible to write a Jamaican book like Spratt Morrison, even with a girl protagonist. My girl protagonist would be a model girl, bright, articulate, perceptive, and fully bilingual, code switching, and moving through Jamaica's unique linguistic landscape with ease and facility. So I really carried a type of Jamaican girl protagonist in my head for a long time. I knew that when I eventually created a world and placed her in it, or followed her in it, I would draw attention to her rich cultural space, the folk culture in which she lives, the histories of her people, their belief systems, the ancestral wisdom of the adults in her world, and the proverbs and folktales that preserve so much of their worldview and shape her values. So I wrote an epistolary novel because I also wanted to move away from the traditional approach, an omniscient third-person narrator, even a distant first person, if a first-person narrator can be distant, using very descriptive prose. I knew I had to write what I have characterized as a talking book by doing something I immensely enjoyed doing, letter writing. But I also knew that these could not just be any everyday type of letter. These letters had to depict the way Jamaicans speak and live in a particular space and the issues that affect their lives at the time I depicted. Perhaps because I grew up with several friends who were children of both parents or one parent who lived abroad, somehow I always knew that I would one day write about migration and its effects on children who knew their parents or a parent only through letters. I also wrote many letters to friends and relatives who lived abroad. This fascination with talking to people through letters, I believe, explains my fascination with the epistolary genre. So I wrote this novel in which a young girl writes letters to connect with her mother. According to Edward Baugh, the letter writing that will bridge an ocean becomes a metaphor for the need to bridge emotional and psychological distance in Aunt Jen. The entire plot is advanced through her letters, and characters, including her absent mother, are depicted through her intriguing letters. Sunshine voices all her experiences for public consumption. It is this public nature of her letters that leads Warner Lewis to say that the letters are a charmingly revelatory mechanism to draw the reader into the mind or personality of Sunshine. There's a difference between writing a novel and then reading the novel. As a writer, I set out to focus on certain themes and issues, but later as a reader, I'm amazed at the many ideas that come to mind as I read. As a writer, I wanted to draw attention to some reasons people migrate, the effects of migration on children left behind. I wanted to highlight the importance of family, heritage, ancestral ties, or maroon heritage. And I simply wanted to depict the ways in which a young girl remains focused and alert despite her frustrating attempt to get to know the person referred to by Edward Baugh as her illegitimate mother. Sunshine writes to a mother who never replies, but she keeps writing because her blood connection will not allow her to not write, suggesting then that blood does matter. Her sharing of events with the silent Aunt Jen is indeed reflective of my time growing up, where people were considered as being accountable to each other. Religious preoccupations in Jamaica have always fascinated me, especially in relation to church preferences, because my own development has been shaped by the attitude of rural folks to church and religion. I also grew up with an array of strong grandmothers, aunts, village women who were all involved in community building. And this became an inevitable part of Sunshine's world that would be explored and would bring into focus issues related to gender and genre. As a literary critic, I was forced to distance myself from the work to probe beyond the thematic foci, to judge the ways in which this fictional collection of letters allows the contemplation, interrogation, and problematizing of several key issues related to diaspora, diasporic identity, migration, subjectivity, identity, and nation. The aspect of the novel which repeatedly served to provide answers was the aspect that in itself had no clear answers, but seemed nevertheless to pose questions. The silence of Aunt Jen, who never replies. It is this silence that led one critic to declare that the novel is very much about the importance of things unsaid. The letters bring to light the matter of scattering, the condition of people who have left their homelands to live in other parts of the world, often in a place in which they are racially and socially different. Scattering is accompanied by ideas of migration, and Sunshine brings attention to the mother, the intended recipient of her letters, living in scatteration, a term used by Jerome Branch. It is this silence that allows rumination about several post-colonial or post-diasporic issues. But Aunt Jen's silence suggests her disinterest in what is happening in Jamaica. This is one way of interpreting her unspoken or unwritten words. Through Sunshine's letters, we witness an attempt to pull her back into a particular identity. But her silence leads us to conclude that she is not actually seeking, perhaps, to preserve the identity that Sunshine expects her to maintain in the Jamaican, British Jamaican, West Indian diasporic connections. The term diaspora seems to be used rather loosely in our local context, especially in Jamaica, I think. The use seems to ignore the widespread disbursement of Caribbean people all over the world. Usually in Jamaica, when we talk about diaspora, we're referring to people who have gone to North America or England a long time ago for the England ones. But there is a widespread disbursement of Caribbean people, Jamaicans in the main, all over the world, to the UK, Canada, Cuba, Nicaragua, Panama, Mexico, Ecuador, at different periods in our history. Often the term is used in a simplistic manner to refer to those in the USA or Canada, the UK, to a lesser extent these days. The specificities or unique context are never usually explored, and the ways in which race, politics, and the specific cultural and socio-economic contexts of the multiple transnational spaces affect our people are not often considered. Very often, politicians and other persons in Jamaica speak of diaspora as though the term referred to one single group of persons. We should be careful then of using the term to homogenize all Jamaicans or Caribbean people anywhere outside of their respective countries and region without the specificity of locale. That is, for instance, Jamaican Canadian, Jamaican Cuban, Jamaican Ecuadorian, Jamaican British. Talks of diaspora are also premised on the assumption that all persons who have emigrated wish to continue to be associated with the past and maintain a particular identity linked to the past. Aunt Jen's silence suggests that perhaps she does not wish to maintain a particular identity that has been used to keep her in the minds of those left behind. It has been argued that migrants adapt to their new societies and many eventually become citizens, but are also able to retain their cultural links and emotional attachments to their homelands. While we end this novel without knowing the truth about Aunt Jen, we may surmise that perhaps there is some ambivalence on her part. Ashcroft and Tiffin speak of the dual ontology, in which the diasporic subject looks in two directions towards historic diasporic cultural identity on one hand and the society of the relocation on the other. The consistent silence with which Sunshine's letters, designed to keep Jen up to date and remind her of her culture, and the socio-political developments in her village and country leads us to question whether or not Aunt Jen is really ambivalent or is simply involved in what may be regarded as the reconstruction of her own cultural and diasporic identity. Sunshine assumes that Aunt Jen still maintains a fixed identity rooted in Jamaicanness, but it could well be that this is not so. Salman Rushdie maintains that the migrant always carries a deep sense of loss. Indeed, loss is different from ambivalence, as the former implies deep longing, mourning, and the desire to repossess the lost home. Ambivalence suggests that the individual is torn between wanting to leave and wanting to stay, suggesting that both places hold the same emotional value to the person, accompanied by indecision. There are no letters from Aunt Jen to indicate any loss on her part, but the very existence of Sunshine's letters and her insistence on writing in the face of ongoing silence speak to her own sense of loss. She is compelled by this sense of loss to write and to make connections with someone whom she understands she's connected by blood. Sunshine assumes that Jen carries a similar sense of loss because the commonly held generalization is that all migrants experience this sense of loss. Here, it seems that the novel problematizes this generalization of the migrant to force us to admit that all migrants do not constitute one homogeneous nostalgic type, but that there may be those for whom leaving results in no desperate longing, but a happy and welcome departure. Here we must consider Sunshine's discovery of Aunt Jen's letter and the phrase she wrote in French, and I'll just translate for this. I want to leave this place. If you read the book, you'll see the French. Indeed, I recall the words. When she finds the note, the note she reads, Jen writes in French and hides, and Sunshine finds later, means, I want to leave this place. Dear God, I want to leave this place. I recall the words of an associate who declared to me, an island is an easy thing to give up. This as she was preparing to permanently leave for Canada. Aunt Jen forces us to rethink our overt tendency to be sorry for the mournful migrant. Of course, we acknowledge that the sense of loss is real for many migrants, and I will always recall the recollections of third-generation migrants in Limon, Costa Rica, who repeatedly recall their grandparents' constant longing and nostalgia for Jamaica and their pledge to one day return home. We want to go home, they used to say. We're going home. One day we're going home to Jamaica. These West Indian migrants clung to the past and recreated their British West Indian culture in Costa Rica, cooking rice and peas, speaking Jamaican Creole and a type of English, playing dominoes, working obia, attending burial scheme and UNIA meetings. Interestingly, Sunshine's discovery of Aunt Jen's secret confession inscribed in French uncovers her private construction of identity from an early age before she leaves Jamaica. It is easy to surmise then that her silence and the absence of any interest in being in contact with Jamaica implies how she has selected to define herself in terms of her connection to a new and European culture. The importance of language as an indication of cultural identity is also presented in the person of Mrs. Delgado, who loses her speech after tragedy, but retains one word in Spanish. So Mrs. Delgado, if you have read the novel, comes from Panama, marries a Jamaican man, comes from Panama, tragedy strikes, she loses her speech. The only word she retains is the word adios. She simultaneously bids goodbye to English and reveals the language, the marker of identity that is embedded deep in her psychosystem and reveals her preferred identity. I spoke about writing earlier and of how as a child I dreamed of becoming a writer. When I wrote Aunt Jen, I was actually a writing teacher. I spent many hours trying to convince my students of the importance of writing for clarifying thoughts, issues, and ideas, for communicating effectively, and for honing one's linguistic skills. They weren't listening to me. I also had always valued writing in my personal life. I wrote a lot as a taciturn young person who enjoyed writing, and I wrote well. I was also very conscious of how many women writers deliberately write to give voice to women, since traditional forms of literature have been mainly male-authored. Remember the list of persons I read at the beginning. Elaine Showalter asserts that women have always been forced to write subversively, claiming the feminist content of feminine art is typically oblique, displaced, ironic, and subversive. I cannot say that I set out to be subversive in the strictly feminist sense that Showalter implies, but I knew that I wanted to create a child narrator who could simultaneously be innocent but deeply probing and alert to inconsistencies in the behavior of people around her or in things people said, and one whose critical skills were sharp. I utilize irony as a crucial discursive strategy. As a writer and literary critic, I was fully aware of the versatility and power of verbal irony in drawing attention to contradictions, inconsistencies, dishonesty, and even hypocrisy. So Sunshine writes to create her own story, include other people's stories, and question stories at the same time. Her story seems simple on the surface, but it's a complex story about growing up and discovering the challenges of understanding adults in her immediate environment and others like Aunt Jen who are absent and silent. It is noteworthy that the young child also questions Caribbean history and several accepted traditions. If you read, you remember a section where she says the guidance teacher told her to pay attention and say the pledge to the Queen, and she said, which one? One of the ones in Africa, and the guidance teacher said, there's only one queen in the world, what are you talking about? And she said, oh, I thought there were many of them. So it's very subversive in her innocence. Cardella Forbes writes, deceptive is the simple prose of Ramsey's child narrator. She masks and reveals several layers of reality that make for a complex, finely nuanced story. Aunt Jen is a sophisticated exploration of the issues of migration, exile, and diaspora from a point of intersection between Caribbean migration in the early days and the present. Ramsey's narrative explores the effect of these issues on children, a group given scant, if any, attention, both in our traditional readings of the Caribbean Bildungsroman and in the current preoccupation with adult, gender, and cross-border identity in diaspora studies. Writing deserves full critical consideration, as Sunshine realizes the importance of writing at an early age and asks Ma if she should write. I asked Ma if she thought it was a good idea to write to you, and she said she will neither say yea nor nay. She said maybe if she was me, she wouldn't write, but she's not me, so I must decide for myself, because it's every donkey to him sankey. So I decided to write. Writing, therefore, becomes the first way in which Sunshine establishes herself as a person of agency, even at a young age. She decides that she wants to write, despite Ma's misgivings. Writing is what she loves. And then we see her saying, you know, when I have nothing to do, I will write. Writing reveals her to be the stubborn, insistent individual who will eventually choose her career path and family members with whom she will associate. She says one day, I cannot write you a longer letter because I hear Ma calling me. She says, I spend too much time writing. And my writing getting me nowhere. I have to stop. It is writing that reveals her feistiness and her ability to use words as weapons. She writes, when I started writing to you, I thought it would be the beginning of a meaningful relationship in which we, me and you, would exchange pleasant, enjoyable, and interesting letters on a regular basis. It was not my idea that I would be the only one writing, and I certainly didn't think I would end up just writing to relay Ma's and Pa's messages. But unfortunately, due to no fault of my own, this is what is happening. I have now become the scribe of two parents who feel neglected by a daughter for whom they scraped up every last penny so that she could make a better life for herself. Notice how manipulative she is as a young teenager. And as she writes, she realizes how this mode of writing allows her to express herself in a direct manner, but also allows her the pretense of pulling Aunt Jen into her own space. And she says, writing is in my bones, and when anything happens, the first thing I think of doing is write about it. The sense of community with which I grew up in rural Jamaica had a very positive impact on me and my impression of Jamaica and rural folk. This is the community spirit that Sunshine conveys, a supportive place in which people take care of each other. Sunshine writes of the people who love her, advise her, nurture her, including men, father figures who help her to feel safe. Uncle Johnny, Uncle Roy, Gramps. So too is portrayed a world of strong women, grandmothers, neighbors who form a strong foundation for her to grow, think, and write. The community is also one in which there is a rich combination of the comic and the tragic which borders on the comic in a carnivalesque sort of way. This is the case in the recounting of Miss Clara's daughter's funeral, and I have to read it. Yesterday evening was Miss Clara's daughter's funeral. Miss Clara from over Boyne's Pasture, not Miss Clara from Crossroads. We are not so sure what happened to her, but she went to Lucy to have her baby and died before the baby was born. Anyway, yesterday when they were marching with her body from the Salvation Army Church to the burial ground, the funeral car got out of control as it was coming down the hill and crashed into the big plum tree at our gate. It crashed into the tree so hard that the coffin flew right out of it and landed on its side in the middle of the gate. The dropping was bad enough, but when the coffin burst open at the sides, everybody started to scream and shout. Some started to run, and Major Ranking started to shout, "Demons of hell, be gone with you!" She shouted even louder when all kinds of things started to tumble out of the coffin. Scissors, broom, needle, thread, baby nappy, baby bottle, baby pin, olive oil, vials with other oils, and a whole heap of other things that I couldn't make out. When the things stopped tumbling out, everybody just stopped bawling and screaming at the same time. Everybody stood there waiting to see if the body would drop out too. When they waited for about a half a minute and nothing happened, Miss Clara threw herself on the ground and started to roll and bawl. Some men ran and lifted up the coffin and started to push back the things into it. Major Rankin said, "Sweet Jesus, resurrector of Lazarus, what is this? Deliver us from this enemy's trap. Demons of hell, be gone." Well, it seems as if Major Rankin teeth could not take the pressure anymore. So by the time she started to say, "Gone" again, the teeth flew right out of her mouth and landed on the pile of things that dropped out of the coffin. I thought Major Rankin would run and grab them up. But instead, she pulled up her white Salvation Army uniform above her knee and ran shouting, "Save me, Jesus, save me." I don't think any of us could catch her at the speed she was going. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the essence of Caribbean performance of tragic comedy, which in itself may be placed fully within a broad Caribbean aesthetics, which includes performance. And Cordella Forbes said, "The Caribbean carnivalesque is performance." Aunt Jen promotes the search for an actualization of individual and national autonomy through the act of writing, and the art of identity formation and reclamation. So declares Paige Gray in an article on national and individual identity in the novel. Indeed, one of the unexpected paths on which I followed Sunshine was the one that led to the exploration of Jamaica's political climate in the 1980s. Even as I wrote, I did not consider that the chronology of events surrounding the Michael Manley era would come to be regarded as paralleling Sunshine's journey into independence and discovery of her identity. But a reading undertaken by Gray seems to support this. Aunt Jen advocates the search for the actualization of individual and national autonomy through writing. It represents a compelling example of Jamaican literature as a means of cultural awareness in that it depicts the very state of becoming Sunshine's physical, intellectual, and emotional narration. Her coming-of-age story corresponds to Jamaica's coming of age after it gained independence from the United Kingdom. During the period in which Sunshine writes, Jamaica grappled with its own self-perception and autonomy. In the years following independence, the country faced the challenge of discerning itself and asserting authority as an entity separate from the United Kingdom after centuries of dependency. As Sunshine continues, so you understand the sort of parallel she's doing. Sunshine is struggling with her growing up and trying to make connection with or decide if she should separate herself from the mother in England, and the reverse is what she's saying is happening with the country politically. As she continues to write, she reflects on a critical period in Jamaica's national and political development. The Manly's campaign that resulted in national exploration of self and heritage, the importance of nation building and identity building, and she begins to further explore history and discovers that history is real because Ma is a real Maroon. Everything I know from history class suddenly turned real through Ma's stories about her parents. Ma's great-great-grandparents were Maroons. My great-great-great-grandmother was either with Kojo, Nanny, or Three Finger Jack. Now I know why Ma is so strong and fiery at her age. In concluding, Sunshine develops in a space typified by linguistic diversity, in which she blends English with Creole and vernacular voices of the community. Sunshine develops and moves from writing in perfect English in the early letters to use Creole increasingly more and more, similar to Ma, as she finds her own voice and identity. Important questions related to gender and female agency are raised by the women reflected in the strong female characters of Ma and Sue, and reflects the violation of stereotypical gender representations. These women are strong, decisive, independent, and innovative. Sunshine develops into a strong woman, bold enough to assert herself and take her own decisions. We are given the impression, too, that identity is shaped by place and geography. Perhaps Aunt Jen is engaged in the restoration of her new identity outside of a context in Jamaica, and therefore is unable to define herself in this way. Paige Gray asserts that birthplace is important in understanding national politics and for establishing identity and self. Sunshine has remained in Jamaica and is therefore able to continue to relate to the place and define herself in this space in a manner in which Aunt Jen cannot. In what we may regard as post-diasporic, we may consider that diaspora is not only about place and the construction of cultural identity, but may be a survival strategy, which may be emotional or even financial. I just want to take 2 minutes to explain the financial part. There's an interesting trajectory of the Jamaicans who left shortly after the Morant Bay Rebellion to go to build the railway line in Panama, Costa Rica, and they were promised their return trips home. That never materialized. So those very innovative Jamaicans started to spread out across the Atlantic coast, down to Ecuador. Some went to Mexico, and many of them went to Cuba. Some of those went to Cuba. And then after that, the migration of Jamaicans to Cuba started to go work with the United Fruit Company and so on. But many Jamaicans, when you go to Guantanamo and you go to Santiago and that part of Cuba, there's such a huge West Indian population. Many persons never knew anything about them until, and it's probably facetious of me to say, and we have a Cuban in the audience, and he me puede decir lo que quiere. One of the political positions that could be taken from, especially now, because it's heightened now, where you have a flurry of descendants of Jamaican Cubans coming to Jamaica in droves. They get their citizenship, and this allows them to go back and forth, best to get jobs in Jamaica. And so you may think that this sudden understanding of their belonging to this Jamaican Cuban diaspora is their strategy for survival at a time, and it began If you study the time when they started, there are two different generations of them. So like Leith's parents who went to Cuba, did what they went to do and came back. But I'm talking about the younger generations who are just discovering that mi bisabuelo, mi bisabuela, mi abuela, mi abuelo, todos, all of them came from Jamaica. Suddenly, grandparents, great-grandparents, everybody. And you come and you get Jamaican citizenship. And I'm suggesting that that understanding or participation in diaspora could well be not just an emotional strategy. It's a strategy for survival, but it is financial. And it is probably necessary, and so you can talk about it. We may consider, too, that the migrant chooses to live and be identified in the way he or she wants to. That is the reason many leave in the first place. I participate in research in diasporic countries, Cuba, communities in Cuba, Ecuador, Mexico, Costa Rica, and so on. And I know that there is the other side. Well, part of the problem is that we all approach them saying, remember I talked about ambivalence and loss at the beginning, that they are displaying all of these qualities. And sometimes we impose ideas in our interactions with them. I will tell you that until academics started to go into the Pacific coast in Mexico, Black Mexicans did not know that they were Black. We went and told them that you are Black, look at me, look at you, touch me, touch my hair, you are Black. They understood themselves to be Mexicans. And then we started to interact with them and conduct workshops and say, this is identity, this is where you come from, this is so and so, because Mexico always taught them that you are simply Mexican, mestizo, okay? So what I'm saying is that this whole business of diaspora is not as simple as we think it is, and in what you consider to be post-diasporic, perhaps it is time to step back and say, I do not necessarily agree with what Peter Phillips said the other day when he said, if the cost of education goes up, Jamaicans and the diaspora will have to pay for it. And I said to myself, why do people in the diaspora have to pay for it? If they don't live here, their children are not here, they can choose to not look back. And we should not chastise people for how they choose. The complexity of diaspora, migration, identity, and post-diaspora seem to be conveyed in an excerpt from one of my own poems called Caribbean Global from October Afternoon. And I'll just read a short excerpt and then I'll be finished. Migration from Kingston, Georgetown, Bridgetown to London, New York, Madrid, Amsterdam, Brussels, journeying, crossing boundaries, remapping the past, deterritorialization, a constant reminder of home, self, and place. Questions of belonging reverberate through the mind. Ardent Grenadian student in the Ivy League University in New England, interrogating knowledge, constructing identity, writing Creole identities, asserting alternatives. All over, Caribbean people in action, decolonization in progress, accommodating local and global. All over the world, Caribbean people engaging oppositional politics, making place, laughing, othering in the face, writing freedom, strumming reggae songs on the bass guitar, writing independent identities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramsey. And of course, we're all going to buy multiple copies of Aunt Jen. We're going to be using Aunt Jen in schools. And members of the network are going to get copies of Aunt Jen and take back. Could I just ask members of the network just to stand so you can see them and just introduce yourselves, those who are here. Andrea? Okay. So these are part of our group of 30, other members here? Yes, 13 of us embarking on this journey, different disciplines, geography, literature, gender and development, sociology, and other disciplines as well. I'm now going to, there's a lot that we can ask, but I'm going to ask Susan to come and introduce our next speaker.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ramsey. That was fantastic. It was a perfect fit for the research themes. It was entertaining, it was enlightening, it was well-researched, everything. Thank you so much. I'm going to introduce Paulette now, who's our next reader. Velma is perhaps well known to most of you. She's a writer and a retired senior lecturer at the University of the West Indies. She's published 4 books of poetry, all published by People Tree Press in the UK. The first was Crown Point and Other Poems, published in 1988. Shame Trees Don't Grow Here, Leaving Traces, 2008, and Carrot Bay Again, New and Selected Poems in 2013, and The Best Philosophers I Know Can't Read and Write. Her prose publications include collections of short fiction, a novel, Home Stretch, published in 1994, Carl, which won the Casa de las Americas Prize. Her academic publications include the well-known, I'm sure, and foundational text, Dread Talk, The Language of Rastafari, and another foundational linguistic text, From Jamaican Creole to Standard English. So welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Professor Ramsey has said everything about migration. What is there for me to tell you about it, except to say that I myself, I used to say migration is my pet peeve. I don't think I should say peeve, has been my pet interest as long as I have written, I think. So this afternoon, is it evening yet? Evening. I'm going to read 2 short pieces. I write short fiction, mostly, when I write fiction. So if I say 2 pieces, they're short, but one is shorter than the other. And the first one I'm going to read is about 30 years younger than the second one, which I'm going to read. And I think I'm making a bit of a point that not much has changed in that time. Now, this is a more recent one, is one of a number of pieces I have written in airports all over the place, partly because I have been forced to wait to make connections, and what is there to do beside write? So, this one is called Kennedy Airport, New York. Can you hear me properly? Thank you. The woman beside me was leaning on the handle of her carry-on case. Her sunglasses were stuck on the crown of a head covered with hair standing on end. I hadn't seen a wig like that before. Every now and then she took a sip from the bottle of water she was carrying. I wondered whether we all had simply been walking around dehydrated before the Americans announced that this was a healthy habit. Easily visible from where we were sitting was an older woman with a small child leaning against her. Both my neighbor and I turned as the woman suddenly started to talk, as if oblivious of the fact that she was addressing us. "The somebody who come in for you better come before Monday. I am your grandmother. I said that, but I have my life to live. I try, God know I try." The mean-faced older woman was talking to, or at, the meekest looking 3-year-old you have ever seen. The little girl looked up at her with eyes at once sad and thoughtful, then held her head down and gazed at the floor. I didn't think she understood much of what the woman said, but she must have caught the emotion. You vex with your granny? Don't vex. The little girl managed a slight smile. I thought of my own 3-year-old granddaughter, strong-willed, opinionated, loved, indulged even, 1.5 feet high and defiant in the presence of an angry father standing 6'4". I recognize it as the kind of fearlessness that takes people confidently through an uncompromising world. I thought of my grandson, who at 2 would climb to the top of the burglar bars and yell, "Save me, save me," completely confident that somebody would. I wondered where the granddaughter of the woman would get the confidence to compete eventually with those and others like them in the corridors of the world. She who had heard her grandmother say clearly that she was anxious to be rid of her. She understood the emotion already. The words would stay with her and make sense later. Jacques said a word on a level. It is true. In another culture, they call the world the playing field. The grandmother's voice piped up again and drew me from my reverie. Don't vex with your granny, you hear, but your granny tired. She hugged the child hard, tears clouding her eyes. I didn't know her story, but I could easily imagine it. I looked at her again and no longer saw a mean-faced old woman. I simply saw a tired, aging woman with a painful story. I knew many like her. Hadn't she given her all, beat out her soul case to raise her own children, possibly without a father? She said she was tired. Hadn't she looked forward to these years to treat herself well, at least to have no responsibility? But she was taking down from New York a grandchild she was almost sure would be left with her. She had flattered herself that they had sent the ticket so she could have a holiday. Why was she so gullible? The truth became clear soon enough. How many other grandchildren had been left with her for 2 or 3 years at a time? Who was the person who was slated to relieve her? Who was the smaddy to whom she referred? The father's sister? Another grandmother like herself? She was obviously not confident that the person would materialize. My eyes made 4 with the woman sipping the water. She was holding her head down. The tissue she moved along her cheeks was stained black with tears mixed with mascara. I looked at the writing pad in my hand and read what I had written when I first saw her enter the departure lounge. Dear Lorna, Goodison that is, you have already written about Bella, so I don't need to write about this lady of exquisitely reined in flesh, held in place by the shortest skirt you have ever seen. Nor do I have to mention some of the flesh escaping under the skimpy top and hanging out over the waist like a soft crag, nor yet about the brassiere straps competing with the top for space along the shoulder and winning, about her hair standing on end in a revised version of Sensefoul, and finally, about the string of cowrie beads at her neck shouting, "I am me and I am proud. Who don't like it, bite it." I ran my pencil through it. I felt a little ashamed. Now she was simply a fellow traveler, another woman with compassion. Thank you. Now the older story, and this one I'm always a little emotional about because this is the first story I ever published. I sent it to a friend. She didn't send it back to me, she just sent it to a journal. And I was lucky, some very important Jamaican who had become a world-famous illustrator was available for that volume of Jamaica Journal. And did what he illustrated? My story. So here we go. My mother. The Lexington Avenue train raced into 14th Street Station like a runaway horse and miraculously came to a stop, belching forth such an army of fast-moving bodies that I flattened myself against the stair rails in sheer terror. But I survived, and after the first flight of stairs, stood near a tiny candy shop in the station to let them all pass. I stared, but only at the blacks, the strangers whom this heartless machine had rushed out of Harlem, out of the safety of the familiar 125th Street and into this alien city, to dingy stores and tiny disorganized offices, or to other vague connections, Canarsie, Long Island, Jamaica, etc. They were all running in some way or other, in careless abandon or in crisp, short, overbred paces, the women's girdles and eventually their coats controlling the obviousness of the movement, the men's coattails flapping at the inevitable slit below the rump. The men, whether they were briefcase types or lunch pan types, all wore little hats with short brims. It was a cold morning. In New York, 23 degrees is considered cold. The women didn't need hats. Cheap, curly wigs hugged their temples, protecting their black youthfulness and hiding their kinky strands. 50 acknowledging 30 needs a wig. For some reason, the real hairline tells a story, even when it is dyed black. And here, the merciful cold allowed for the constant sweater or the little scarf that covers the telltale neck. Everybody was running and everybody looked frightened. But you could see that all this had become natural. This speed was now normal, and because they couldn't see their own frightened faces, they couldn't recognize their fright. When you answer long enough to a name that for one reason or another is wrong, and when you live long enough with a face that is always wrong, a frightened look grows on you and becomes an inseparable part of you. I looked at them and became numb with a kind of nameless grief, for I had seen my mother for the first time in all those tense women's faces, in all those heads hiding their age and gentleness beneath the black curly wigs. The little journey was a ritual. Very early the first or second Saturday morning of the month, my grandmother and I would walk to Ansridge and get in the line at the bank. I would sign my name on the money order made out to me, and we would soon move from the foreign exchange line to the savings line. I never knew how much money came, for the exchange from dollars to pounds was too much for me to handle, and I never knew how much was saved, but I always felt one Saturday every month that we were rich. Sometimes we stopped in the big Ansridge stores in town and bought a new plate or two, sometimes dress material, and very occasionally shoes. Then we stopped in the market for the few things Gran didn't plant and Mas Nathan's shop didn't stock. The journey home was less pleasant. I never ever noticed the hills on the way back, not because they were so much less green, but because it took all my energy to think of little stories to help me block out Gran's monthly lecture. It always had to do with ingratitude. I'm not sure now how she knew the extent of my ingratitude long before I even understood the concept of gratitude. It had to do with the faithfulness of her daughter working hard in America to support me so I could come to something, and my not trying to show thanks. I was no great writer, but Gran saw to it that I scratched something on an air letter form to my mother every month, and that something always included thanks for the money. Gran never made it clear in what nonverbal ways I should express thanks. I had to do well at school, but the teachers had a sort of foolproof mechanism for assuring that. Those were the days of the rod, and I meant to be a poor customer for that. So school was okay, but the guidelines at home were less clear. An action that one day was a sign of ingratitude was next day a normal action. It seems that the assessment of my behavior was a very arbitrary and subjective exercise and depended partly on Grant's moods. Now I understand what Grant's dilemma was like. She herself did not know what she had to produce from the raw material she was given if her daughter's sacrifice was not to be meaningless. She had been set a great task, and she was going to acquit herself manfully, forgive the gender, at all costs. But she was swimming in very strange waters. Her daughter could only work and send money, and she couldn't offer guidelines either. Only vague hints like the necessity for me to speak properly, however that should be. Every year we expected my mother home on vacation, and every year she wrote that she was sorry she couldn't make it. But she always sent, as if to represent her, a large round box that people insisted on calling a barrel. It was full of used clothes of all sorts, obviously chosen with little regard for my size or my grandmother's size. I never went to the collecting ceremony. This involved a trip to Kingston and endless red tape. I merely waited at the gate till the bus turned the curve, gave its 2 honks, and slid along the loose stones to a halt to let my grandmother out. Then the side man would roll the barrel along the top of the bus and shove it to his comrade. Immediately the bus would honk again and move on. Nothing smells exactly like my mother's boxes. It was a smell compounded from sweat and mustiness and black poverty inheriting white cast-offs. I still remember one of those dresses from the box. With today's eyes, I can see that it was a woman's frock, a short woman's voile frock for cocktail parties or an important lunch. And I was 9 or 10 then. But I wore it with pride. First to the Sunday school Christmas concert, and then to numerous social events thereafter. And even now, that low-slung waist or anything resting lightly on the hips has particular charm for me, whether or not the beholder's eyes share my judgment. There were blouses and shoes and hats, something to fit almost everybody in my grandmother's endless chronicle of cousins. We accepted our ill-fitting fits and wore them with surprising confidence. Every year we expected my mother home on vacation, but she never came. The year I was in 3rd form, they flew her body home. I hadn't heard that she was ill. I felt for months afterwards that my very last letter should have said something different, something more, should have shown more gratitude than the others. But I could not possibly have known that that would be the last. When the coffin arrived, it was clear that nobody from Jamaica had touched that coffin. Sam Isaacs may have kept it a few days, but that was all. The whole thing was foreign. Large, heavy, silvery, straight from the USA. And when they opened the lid in the church so she could lie in state and everybody could look and cry, it was clear that my mother too had been untouched by local hands. She had come straight from the USA. When my mother left Jamaica, I couldn't have been more than 5 or 6. So any memory I had of her was either very vague or very clear and original, carved out of my own imagination with patterns all mixed up of other people's mothers and of those impersonal clothes and the annual burial. The woman in the coffin was not my mother. The woman in the purple dress and black shoes, I didn't even know they buried people in shoes. The lightly purple powdered face framed by jet black curls and covered lightly with a mantilla was not like any of the several images I had traced. The funeral couldn't be our funeral. It was a spectacle. I don't suppose more than half the people there had actually known my mother. But it was a Sunday, and the whole week that had elapsed between the news of her death and the actual funeral made it possible for people from far and near to make the trip to our village, Those who were from surrounding districts but had jobs in the city used one stone to kill two birds. Visit the old folks at home and come up to Miss Angie's daughter's funeral. It wasn't our funeral. It was a spectacle. The afternoon was hot. Inside the church was hotter. Outside, I stood as far as I could from the grave and watched several of them pointing at me, their eyes full of tears. That's the little one she left with Miss Angie. Near to me was a woman in a fur hat, close-fitting with a ribbon at the side. She wore a dress of the same yellow gold as the hat, long earrings and costume jewelry of the same yellow gold. I could hear the trembling voices from the grave. I know not, oh, I know not what is me dear. And fur hat beside me, trying to outdo them so her friend could hear her. I didn't know her, but I said, if is fat killer now? My mother was rather busty, but that was as far as the fat went. She didn't wait for an answer, but continued, I never see one of these deads that come back from England yet. No one had taken the trouble to tell her it was America, not England. But the reason why I come to see her is because I was there myself. And I always say, if I dead, they must send me back. It's no see how I would have look. But thank God I'm lucky I come back from my own steam. And you see this big funeral she have? She wouldn't have get it in England, you know. Since 1 o'clock she would have gone if they cremate her. While we're drinking a cup of tea, she burning. What? Asked her audience at last. They gives tea and people sit down. Man, they put them in something like an oven and by the time we just drink the tea, you get the ashes and you're gone. They had stopped singing about my mother's joys. The slow, heavy dirge was now Abide With Me, sung with the Baptist rhythm, sad and slow, though I hardly think it is possible for that particular song to be anything but sad and slow, Baptist or no Baptist. I looked towards the crowd. They were supporting my grandmother. I knew she wasn't screaming. She was never given to screaming. She was just shaking as great sobs shook her body, and her hands seemed to hold up her stomach. It was pointless my trying to comfort her. They wouldn't let me. 2 old women were holding her, Miss Emma, her good friend, and Cousin Jean, who was more like a sister than a cousin. Next day, I went alone to my mother's grave to push my own little bottle with maidenhair fern into the soft red earth. When all their great wreaths with purple American ribbons had long faded, my maidenhair fern started to grow. I had never known my mother. I had known her money and her barrels and my grandmother's respect for her. I had not wept at her funeral. But that morning, in the subway station at 14th Street, in the middle of nowhere, in the midst of a certain timelessness, I wept for her, unashamedly, and for the peace at Anne's Ridge that she never came back to know. After the constant madness, after the constant terror of all the 14th Street subway stations in that horrifying workhouse. I saw my tears water the maidenhair fern on her grave to a lush green luxuriance. I was glad I was a guest in the great USA, and a guest didn't need a wig. I would take no barrels home with me. I saw my mother's ancient grave covered again with its large and gaudy wreaths. Like the mad old man in Brooklyn, I lifted from 100 imaginary heads 100 black and curly wigs and laid them all on the ancient grave. And I laid with them all the last shapeless, ill-fitting clothes from the last barrel. The last of the women had hurried away. I wept for my mother, but I rejoiced that the maidenhair fern was lush and that we had no longer need for gaudy wreaths. I thank you.
Awesome.
Please give her another hand. I want to now invite Dr. Aisha Spencer, one of our lecturers from the Department of Language and Literature Education at the School of Education, to come and introduce our next presenters. And today, Dr. Spencer gave a wonderful presentation at our seminar. Please welcome her.
It is very hard to come and introduce another poet after the kind of reading we just had a while ago. I had to now assume a posture of seriousness once again. But the truth is that the poet I'm about to introduce to you is someone who always is smiling, always is bubbling with laughter, so it's probably quite fitting. I'm going to introduce now to you, ladies and gentlemen, Jamaican poet Tanya Shirley, who's the author of She Who Sleeps with Bones, which was published in 2009 and was, of course, a Jamaican bestseller. And she's also the author of The Merchant of Feathers, which was published in 2014. Recently a beaming bride, I think some of the glow is still on her face. She also hails from the Department of Literatures in English. Her writings have appeared in Small Acts, in Caribbean Writer, and I believe in New Caribbean Poetry and Anthology. She travels extensively and reads her poems, I would say, all across the globe is a safe, a safe statement. She has one of the descriptions I have seen of her is that I really like. Is one comment was that Tanya is a constantly maturing poet. And every time that keeps jumping out of me because I've known Tanya for about 15 years and literally I have been able to watch that kind of consistency in the maturity of the poetry that she puts out or her maturing as a poet. Her writing is vivid. And I would say is packed with poetic detail, sometimes so much so that you have to watch your own body language and facial expression upon reading it. Recently, she received the silver medal, I hope I'm right, in the Musgrave Awards. So I want us to give her a hand for that. I think that's a great accomplishment. So, she who always wears a smile, Tanya, can you please step forward, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Jamaican poet Tanya Shirley.
Thank you, Aisha, or I should say, Dr. Spencer, and thanks, Dr. Dunn, for inviting me. I will just jump right in. I'm a little under the weather. I think it's the rain, so I'm not sure how much I'll be smiling today, but I'll try. The day I felt like migrating. For D. Your father, still in church attire, crisp pair of pants, long sleeve shirt the grandchildren gave him this Christmas. Your father, fresh from singing, baritone still trembling in the rafters, still warm from prayer and exiting church hugs. Your father, elder appointed on this day to deposit the tithes, too hefty for the slender security of a church. Your father, who walks with God in his stride to the bank, is accosted by a man witnesses later say looked like he was asking for directions, but he pulls a gun. Your father steps back in defiance, pivoting on the certainty of right over wrong. He maintains his grip on the bag of fat dollar bills. Your father is shot, and still he runs, holding on to what he knows belongs to God, not this man with the gospel of bullets. Your father drives himself to the hospital. In traffic, we never know how the man behind us bleeds. And we all have our days when, especially if we live here, when we think of migrating. This happening more frequently, but that's a whole other story. This other poem I wrote when I was doing my master's at the University of Maryland. And we all know when we live away from home, Sunday is probably one of the hardest days. Sunday ritual. I would buy a bottle of cheap red wine, keep it on the dining room table like a fine sculptured statue until Sunday came, when I would pour its contents, pretending it was the ocean fermented to red, into a fake crystal glass and drink glass after glass after glass until all that remained was the bloody bottom of the sea. Sundays were always hard on my heart, easy on my pen. I was never a poet then, just a girl longing to be home. Longing to be in the presence of my mother's complaining. Why you young people don't like church, eh? The old choir so old that all of them combined do have a full mouth of teeth. To be home again, I would give the old people all my teeth, hand wrap them and deliver them at the altar like a mash-mouth virgin. Here my mouth is full, but my tongue is numb. Just for remembrance, I talk patois to the furniture. The brown couch is a broad-backed woman with a basket of fruits on her head, and 3 sons at home sleeping. The coffee table is always my father, stained in the middle and most days left unpolished. The snow stuck to the patio door is the ripe belly of a coconut I speak to while eating. Here, you must turn food into language. Cook tin ackee and fresh codfish until the aroma says, "Morning, how you do? Long time no see." On Sundays, the heater is set to sunshine. And with my breasts drooping in a floral cotton wrap, sweat trickling past my navel into my communion cup, I curl up and die another day in this place. You can laugh. And this poem, Recompense, was commissioned for the, I don't remember the name of the project, I'm very sorry, but it was some Commonwealth United project, and we read it for the BBC, and they did postcards, and yes, Recompense. Remember how Janet get up in history class and say she not black? And we laugh and tell her to sit her black backside down. But Janet say, we too fool for school. She half Scottish. And somebody tug on Janet Platt and say, look how your head tough. And Janet say, don't make that fool you. Naked eye don't see the blood. In 18-something, her great smaddy step off a boat and dig up her great smaddy out the cane field to taste the sweetness of local sugar. No sense buying pussy in a bag. And she not letting Scotland get away scot-free. She laying claim to that money that built bronze statues and columned empires on cobblestone streets. And she said, bet you when Scotland issue apology and say all half-breeds line up here for recompense, all of we who black and a bray like ass will start sing different tune. But she going be first in line. All along she singing the same thing. There is money in this blood, money in this blood. And somebody in Janet family must have been drawing a family tree, because she swear is Scotland her people come from. And we laugh and ask Janet if she sure is not Ireland or England. We said, Janet, sit down. You can't even find we own Clarendon and Miss Dawson map. When we graduate, news fly on a paper plane tell we that Janet went to London to study, but money run out, and she couldn't find not one white family. And Lord of mercy, we hear she turn all shade of black. And then this one was published in an anthology called New Boots and Pantisocracies, edited by W.N. Herberts and Andy Jackson. And they did an anthology of, they asked poets to contribute to this anthology chronicling the first 100 days after the UK elections in 2015. And, you know, part of this diaspora thing is the connections that we make. So I had gone to the Stanza Poetry Festival in St. Andrew in Scotland, read and met one of the editors, and then a few years later he reached out to me and said, hey, we'd like some, you know, more global input. How do you think living in Jamaica, this election, and you know, they were talking about austerity and all of that, how is this affecting you? So I wrote this. And I cannot sing, so forgive me. All of us nervous. See me in me heels and ting. You know that song? Yeah, okay, you sing it. See me in me heels and ting. Them checks say we hip and ting. But this thong is too tight. These boots squeeze my brain. Cousin Bev says small sizes take up less space in the barrel she sends once a year. True them no and ting. How down to this long hair was paid for by the sweat of one woman's brow. Austerity is nothing new to her. Her whole life is a cutback, so we back home can sport in our khaki suit and ting. Still, she was hoping. Something about that word conservative makes her nervous. We tell her come home for a wash-off in the sea, a belly full of familiar air. Come make we give her a little bass so she wind up her waist. She says, stop the blasted styling and singing. This is the year of corns and calluses, extra small panties. She's trying to buy a house. Soon love may be the only thing she's sending. And this one, I've never read this one before, and this was published in 2009. I don't know why, but The Life Left Behind. So this was me imagining a woman leaving her family, possibly for another man, possibly to go to foreign. She's leaving, and what do you do that really makes your family know that this is final? You know, like what's that final act to let them know this is it? Because you know lots of women leave several times. How do you let them know this is the final one? The life left behind. This time when she left you, she didn't take the children, nor the revealing dresses, not even the deep purple one with roses you had given her last Christmas instead of the usual household appliance or your disappearance. Not even her lipsticks with their stale smell, nor the blue and gray eyeshadows that made her dream. She saw in the faces of her children the moments they were conceived, especially Lutie, whose brown eyes always made her feel guilty for staying and for leaving. She left a message on the stationery your grandfather had given as a wedding gift. Her words would never let you know she was leaving this time for good. So she left you little drawings of birds with their beaks so pointed you thought they were carrying knives in their mouths. And thank you. So I'll read this one. I was going to read this other one, but okay. I'll read this one. How Dreams Grow Fat and Die. So I'm doing my PhD, the one I've been doing for like 50 years, and Professor Ramsey's talk was especially important to me, and so many other things she spoke about I'm grappling with in the PhD. It's entitled Memory and Invention, Tropes of Diaspora, and I'm looking at Caribbean female poets and, you know, what is remembered, what is forgotten, and how, based on, you know, what is remembered, what is forgotten, women construct and invent new language, new, you know, a new sense of self, a new identity. But one of the things I'm always interested in is how a kind of diasporic sensibility often develops before we even touch the plane or hit the plane. That even where we are sometimes, I remember walking into a class once to give a lecture, I think I was guest lecturing for one of Dr. Butler's classes, and we were talking about migration in Darren Brand's work. And I asked, it was about 40-something students, and I said, who here wants to migrate after you finish the university degree? And all 40-something put up their hands. And when you sit down, and even while you're in a class in Jamaica and your mind is already somewhere else, I argue that there is already a kind of diasporic sensibility taking place. This one is how dreams grow fat and die. And it's also how sometimes the spirit is killed. I'm going very far, but when you read a poem, and yeah, it's a little stretch, but I think I just wanted to give that speech. But it's the way in which sometimes that kind of spirit is molded and shaped from childhood experiences. How dreams grow fat and die. So this is for the, children are here, so I can't call the word, ballet teacher I had when I was a child. How dreams grow fat and die. All summer, I practiced walking in wooden tip ballet shoes. Pretended God was pulling me up. 10-year-old marionette steps stuttering from room to room. Flat-footed, I traced grout lines in our kitchen with encyclopedias on my head, balancing dreams of twirling off stage into the sails of standing ovations. In September, you told my mother I was too fat to be a ballerina. You, a faux British accent and hollowed collarbones I imagined were teacups. You who wanted a kukumkum orchestra, a herd of bones gliding under the baton of your arms. You who illustrated to my mother my incompetence by drawing a circle in the air. I was the round nightmare, landing heavy in the melody of Grand Jetés. You could keep me back with the younger girls. Maybe in a year or two I would shed the fat, reverse blossom into fragrant bud. Or I could donate my tutu now to the kingdom of dust cloths, hang my ballet shoes by their wooden tip necks. In dreams, I am a feather, buoyed and buoyant, and you are the barbed wire that kills me. But it's this idea of, when you watch the movies and you have the encyclopedias on your head and you're practicing to be a ballerina. Nobody practices to be a ballerina in Jamaica. You practice to be somewhere else, and you have the standing ovations, and you have these dreams, and very often the dreams are of you being somewhere other than here. And so I'll just read one more. And this one is Dining at Customs. And we all know an older lady like this who's lived abroad for a really long time and just doesn't give a hoot. Dining at Customs. Miss Gloria had risen early that morning, cooked the goat she had killed and seasoned the night before in a Dutch pot over a coal fire in her cousin Doris's backyard, right between the coconut trees that lived through 3 hurricanes. She would eat it when she got in from the airport, the yellow spicy meat fragments of sunlight settling in her stomach, warming her bones with memories of somewhere other than this place where William, her son, recipient of scholarship to Harvard, had settled, then sent for her. She arrived during summer, pleased that here too there was heat. The first winter, she spoke to no one. Betrayed by the suddenness of cold, the imperialism of snow, the son who learned to live with below zero. For 5 years, she cleaned, cared for his zombie children, took orders from his wife, who Miss Gloria swears is secretly a man. One day, head tied, brown socks pulled up to her knees, arms akimbo, she said, William, I'm going home for a little holiday. Too much people dying behind my back. For 2 months, she sat on a veranda regaling the district with Uncle Sam's stories. How everywhere have elevator, bright lights, fast service, how her grandchildren smart, and her daughter-in-law pretty like money and soft-spoken like any English lady. And now this customs man, face pale like alabaster, telling her she can't carry unfrozen curried goat through customs. Miss Gloria takes off her maroon sweater, spreads it on the industrial carpet, laps her long floral skirt between her thighs, eases her body to the floor. She's sorry she don't have fork or glass full of lemonade. Sorry Doris not here so they can chat and eat. Sorry this man don't come from anywhere. Sorry he going try to stop her as she put the first piece of meat to her mouth. And she thinking, is that she waiting for long, long time. Thank you.
Wow, we've had a feast, ladies and gentlemen. We've heard from Professor Ramsey, from Dr. Velma Pollard, and now Tanya Shirley. Please just give them another round of applause. We've had a wonderful week. We went to the African Caribbean Institute of Jamaica, as well as the Institute of Jamaica, the archives, and I encourage all of you to use the resources there because there's so much work to be done. We've had presentations from our various scholars within the network, as well as young scholars here at the University of the West Indies. And there's just so much work that is being done and more work to be done. I'm going to open the floor for a few questions, comments, and don't all shout at once, please. You could just project right now, please.
Thank you very much for your question. I'm glad you made that connection because as I sat and listened to that story, I was smiling because I found that there were so many different ways in which that story spoke to different aspects of gender. That's a very interesting point because the child and the grandmother react in almost a similar manner in which this child, looking on at these ugly, horrible things that mother has sent, the mother says, in fact, the mother packs them up and gives them back to him and says, we don't want your ugly things and whatever from England. But to come to your question, yes, and if you recall that towards the end of my paper, one of the points I was making is that these diasporic connections and diasporic identities are not just formed because people genuinely, and I don't know if that is the word, or people appropriately feel this connection, right? Or that on the part of the migrant, they or the person who is a descendant of migrants, that they necessarily feel this sense of belonging and identity with those back home. The example I gave was the example of Cuba, where there is a lot of the reconnecting that is being done as a survival strategy because economically things are so bad. So as bad as we think things are in Jamaica, it is much better for a lot of those people in Guantanamo and Santiago. And so when you find an old birth certificate dating back to 1906 and you say, wow, this is my Jamaican citizenship, and they go to the passport office. Jamaica is the only country that will allow you, in the Caribbean, that will allow you to earn citizenship even up to third generation. Barbados, St. Vincent, all the others say you have to prove that it was your parents who migrated to the country. So you have a lot of descendants of people from St. Vincent, St. Kitts and so on, who are, very envious of the Jamaicans who are able to come. And it's just a whole long story of how beneficial this Jamaican citizenship is to them. Many of them come and work, they get jobs because they can teach Spanish, so that's the biggest market for them. They teach Spanish all over the rural areas in Jamaica. Some of them comes and then, once they have a Jamaican passport, it's easier for them to get the visa to go to the US. Some don't bother to wait on the visa. The next step is to take a flight to Mexico, because Jamaicans don't need visas to go to Mexico through Panama, and then you know what follows, crossing the border. So there is that aspect of, before the war, that aspect of this diaspora connection. That's what I meant by it. So we can also see it as a survival strategy, and it's not an emotional one. Sometimes it's an emotional one. That's what we get in Tanya's point. The emotional strategy. You recreate Jamaica in your room in Maryland. But there is also that financial strategy, that financial motive, and it works both ways. So on this side, we have Peter Phillips saying, oh, the diaspora needs to pay for education, right? We think that they owe us. And the other point I was making in my questioning of the whole phenomenon is that nobody owes us anything. If people go, they left in the first place because they wanted to leave for a number of reasons. And nobody has to turn around and say, this is yours, even if it is old clothes. Right? So I hope I answered your question. But it is.
Any other questions, comments? Andrea.
So thank you so much.
Please come, Andrea.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I was really impressed with the ways that the two readings of the poetry short stories spoke to the novel and really forced us to think in complex and nuanced ways about not just migration but relationships as well, between the kinds of problems of mothering and grandparenting, for example. I wondered, Shirley, whether or not you had ever thought about doing a follow-up novel in which the mother responds or says why she does not respond, right? So a follow-up novel from the perspective of the mother. And I have to apologize, I haven't yet read it. I certainly will, but I haven't yet read it. When you started to talk about the novel, I certainly appreciate what you're saying about the diaspora not being homogenous and so on. But based on the stories that I have heard repeatedly living in Canada now for 20-something years, I couldn't help, the mother I saw, the mother I imagined was struggling in Canada in a little one-room apartment without a steady job, unable to live up to the expectation of the Canadian dream, and embarrassed and ashamed to let anybody know. And so she couldn't answer the letters.
Yes. Well, you may remember that I started looking at silence, because the silence for me is the most troubling part of the book, because we don't know what the silence means. And as readers, as critics, we can step back and interpret the silence in different ways. I look at it in different ways. It could be ambivalence. It could be that she doesn't carry that sense of loss that people expect her to carry. It could be that she has left, she doesn't care. A myriad of explanations. It could be that she is struggling. There are all sorts of leadings that you could take from the novel and say, perhaps it's this one because the child says so, or Ma says so, or Aunt Sue says so. There is one in which she has a dream, and when she goes to Mother Penny says, oh, it's because she have a man in her life who ruling her and controlling her, and she can't tell him that she have a child in Jamaica and so on. There's several other things that you could I was asked from shortly after the book came out, I was repeatedly asked, you need to write. I never felt, I didn't get there until about 2 years ago. I thought I was finally at the place where I was ready to write. And that's where I am. I started 2 years ago writing the response, and I'm following the leads. I'm just going where, yes. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question you asked, when I was listening and thinking about family, not a family, but a former caregiver for our children who lived with us for 5 years, found a family there. She migrated with us to the UK, and she died early this year. And a lot of cause for reflection. Persons who migrate, many of the persons who migrate to places like the UK without a very high level of education and find very marginal jobs, they become sick, and they don't want their relatives at home to know what has happened. They die, right? And one of the conversations I had with this friend was constantly feeling that she had to send a burial. So, she was able to come back with us, she stayed, but because she didn't think that she could just come back without having acquired a lot of wealth. And that is the pressure that a lot of migrants experience, and we need to capture some of those stories, because they're very painful. Her family was devastated because, they're always putting their hand up but not recognizing the kind of sacrifices that are made just to survive.
Thanks. Just to come back to your question, so in May when I was in England, I started talking to a lot of women in their 80s and so on who would have gone as young women. Some of them left children in Jamaica who are now, adults. You would not believe that there are people, it's difficult to believe that there are people who left over, let's say 60 years ago, they have never come back. And they left a boy in Spanish Town or a girl in Santa Cruz. They have never seen them again. And there are many reasons. You'll be surprised to know the explanations. The survival, so part of the survival is not telling the man who wants to marry you that you had a child in Jamaica before leaving. Because the part of attracting this man is presenting yourself as being pure and virginal and whatever, and how could you have had a child by, Holy Mary conception kind of thing. So a lot of women say nothing, right? And then there's also, and I'm probably telling some of the people now, there was also the case that when you went to England in the 50s and early 60s and so on, their British girls themselves, English girls, were not allowed to have children out of wedlock. It was, you had the scarlet letter stamped on you, the child was taken from them in many cases, and there are a lot of people who were adopted in that time who are now finding their real parents in England. They're taken from them, put into homes. So here you come from Jamaica now, or Barbados or wherever, and you have a child. That was such a despicable thing. So you never spoke. And there are those women now who are sitting in their 80s and they carry that burden and that guilt. So it's a very interesting story.
Yeah, Yeah. Any last questions? Yes? Please go. Thank you all very much for your wonderful presentations. I want to address the two poets. Now, I've always been very fascinated and impressed by people who can write poetry. I actually long to be able to do that, so I want to ask you both more personal question. What actually inspires you to write such wonderful poetry? So both of you.
Dr. Pollard is here bullying me. The thing about it is that when I teach creative writing, I tell students that you should never be in Jamaica and have writer's block. You can step outside and just hear the most fascinating conversations. I mean, Jamaicans speak in poetry. The things we say, the terms, all of that. So for me, my biggest inspiration is just observation. Just observing the environment, people, and also, my husband and I have this, I reckon we have to say husband as many times. but it's interesting because he's in our completely other, he's in finance. But we have this thing where he'll be picking up somebody visiting from overseas for work, and he has to prep me. He goes, now be on your best behavior. And what he means is that the person gets in the car, and in half an hour, I'm like, so, where do you live? Are you married? Are you in love? What do you like? How much do you get paid? What do you do? And I mean, I just ask so many questions because for me, to be a poet means to be intellectually curious, to constantly want to know every detail. My husband called it fast, but it's alright. But it's this thing where I just meet somebody new and I just can't help it. Like it takes over. I want to know everything. And that inspires me, and then from there you build a narrative. You build this background, as Professor Ramsey did and Dr. Paulette did. You build a background, you imagine things, you fill in the gaps. But overall, it's a general interest and vastness, in people and their situations.
Well, the thing about this vastness, I have a lot of friends who are very they tolerate me as I ask questions and questions and questions. They say, my friend. So I'm glad to hear trying to say this. So now I will say it is the writer in me. All right. If you write fast, you can't do it. Okay. I'm going to ask Susan if we come on to the boat of time so we can have feast of food. Afterwards, we'll have a feast of words, of literature.
I'd just like to thank everybody for coming once more, and to thank the writers specifically. We have a small gift for each of them, so that's not going to go through the mic. So. So thanks again to the network, thanks to everybody for coming, thank you to the technicians, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.
And refreshments. So we invite you now to mix, mingle, talk to some of the writers, prepare your own stories for publication, yes? And thank you so very much for coming.